Good morning. I think the easiest place to begin today, if we're going to talk about whether or not green infrastructure can mitigate the effects of flooding, we have to kind of describe why flooding generally occurs. Flooding is not just a consequence of too much precipitation or too much rainfall, but primarily it's a consequence of rainfall intensity exceeding the rate at which water can be absorbed by the soil. Okay. The reason I make that distinction is because it gives us a good indication of where certain solutions and problems occur. We can't do anything to change precipitation intensity or the amount of precipitation that falls from the sky. So what we have to address are the soils which absorb that precipitation. And generally speaking, we've done a very poor job of taking care of our soils. In more rural communities, poor farming practices with plowing and things like that can actually impact the structure of the soil and restrict water from entering. In a lot of cases in New Mexico, where I'm from, our forests have too many trees and because of the suppression of fires, and now when we have fires, we've created a water repellent layer and we get more runoff and flooding because of that. And in some cases, due to overgrazing, the compaction of soil by too many animals can restrict water from entering the soil in more rural communities. In more urban communities, the effects on soil are much more obvious. We've basically capped the soil with concrete sidewalks, asphalt roads, and metal rooftops. And essentially by capping this soil surface, we've ended up with a lot more flooding than we had historically. But even more concerning to me is that we've effectively dried out the landscape. So not only are we creating more water during precipitation events, we actually have less water going into the soil and we're drying out our landscape even during times with normal precipitation. I would argue, therefore, that green infrastructure shouldn't just be implemented to mitigate flooding, but we should also be looking at it as an opportunity to enhance soil moisture. And so what I'd like to present today is to quantify not only how much water we're capturing in rain gardens, but how much soil moisture we're enhancing by storing that water in those rain gardens. I come from the community of Santa Fe, New Mexico, in northern New Mexico. It's a community of about 75,000 people. And as you can see in this map on the upper left, the community, which is outlined in gray, largely falls within the confines of the Santa Fe watershed. As the community has been developing and growing, we've been increasing the amount of roads and streets throughout the area. And it's estimated by city planners that during an average year of precipitation, almost 1.2 billion gallons of water falls on impervious surfaces and is essentially being displaced. That water is forced to run down our streets and into our gutters, where it generally overwhelms our arroyos and the river itself. The inability of those channels to accumulate that much water all at once has led to those channels incising and eroding. The Santa Fe River, which is in a picture on the bottom left and on the bottom right, has essentially incised by as much as 40 or 50 feet in some places over the last several decades. Not only is that a tremendous cost to the infrastructure in terms of trying to protect that channel, but it's come at a very large ecological cost, because as the water table, or as the river has incised, the surrounding water table has dropped as well, and so essentially our springs are drying up. And we're losing our riparian habitat along the river. With recent years of drought, the community of Santa Fe has become more open to opportunities for improved infiltration. Essentially, they've been open to the idea of adopting rain gardens on a small scale. These are some of the initial concerns that the city was worried about, things like whether or not they would drain within a period of 24 hours, or if we were going to be creating mosquito habitat, whether or not they would be a drowning hazard for children and things like that. As the city has adopted those principles, they've allowed for greater complexity in the rain gardens that we've started to design. We now excavate soils much deeper and replace them with more porous material like wood chips and composts and sands to actually improve infiltration and also to remediate some of the common stormwater pollutants like heavy metals and petroleum products that are entering them. They've even started to allow us to cap storm drains along streets and parking lots and daylight that water above ground again in order to increase the amount of water going into the basins. These are some examples of some of the recent basins that we've implemented. In order to address sediment, the top left photo there shows water that's coming off of about a half an acre of street that runs parallel to the Santa Fe River. Historically, that water has been dropped into a storm drain and has inundated the river, not been allowed to infiltrate the soils in the riparian zone. So now the water actually ends up in this smaller basin up there on the top left. Sediment that's carried down the street is dropped out, and then it enters a 8-inch diameter pipe there in the middle, flows underneath the sidewalk and ends up going into the basin on the bottom left. Over the course of the year, we estimate that that basin by itself will accumulate over 100,000 gallons of water. The basin on the bottom right is capturing water from over an acre of impervious surface in a residential area. It's estimated that we'll capture over 200,000 gallons per year in that one. And then there's a smaller example on the top right at the Santa Fe Community College of a basin that's capturing water from maybe about 10,000 square feet of roadway. But basically all three of these basins more or less would be able to accumulate precipitation from a high intensity storm of at least 1/4 inch per hour. During lower intensity storms, those basins would allow that water to infiltrate over time and could accumulate runoff from a much larger storm. So in terms of the question as to whether or not green infrastructure can address flooding problems, I would say without a doubt I think there are opportunities. You can certainly increase the frequency or the number of basins along streets and parking lots to address larger storms. But generally speaking, I think they're a great opportunity and a great way of offsetting runoff from lower intensity events in our municipalities. But I'll say again, I don't think flooding is the primary concern that we should have. I actually think our biggest concern these days is drought and basically the way in which our impervious surfaces are drying out the landscape. So what I'd like to share with you now is some research that we've been conducting that looks at water catchment in some of the rain gardens and how much we're improving soil moisture and where some of that water that we're capturing is actually going. At the Santa Fe Community College, we have a parking lot with several curb cuts. The parking lot is about 25,000 square feet. There are 7 evenly spaced curb cuts along the parking lot. So each one drains about 3,500 square feet of asphalt. Very small area. We implemented 2 rain gardens at 2 of the at the curb cuts, and we left 2 of the curb cuts without rain gardens. Each rain garden, or the 2 rain gardens that we built were 15 feet long by 10 feet wide and 1 feet deep. So essentially they had a capacity of a little over 1,000 gallons. And during the course of a year with average precipitation of about 9.5 inches, we would expect that those rain gardens would accumulate about a little over 10,000 gallons of water. So not too much. The clays in the area, or excuse me, the soils in the area are clay loam, so very fine texture. And basically what we wanted to do is we wanted to monitor soil moisture in the profile at the curb cuts with and without rain gardens. We installed soil moisture probes at 6-inch increments below the soil surface down to 30 inches in both the rain gardens and at the curb cuts without rain gardens. We were able to measure volumetric water content, basically the percentage of water in the soil every hour over the course of a year. The probes basically monitor or measure a volume of soil that's slightly larger, or about 1 liter in size. We also had a small precipitation gauge in the bottom right-hand photo. You can see it, which measured precipitation down to 1/100th of an inch so that we could compare soil moisture as it passed through the soil profile as a response to rainfall events. What we found is that not only did soil moisture improve in the rain gardens, significantly improve in the rain gardens at each depth, but also overall, on average, if you were to average the 5 depths together, we had about a 17% increase in the amount of water being held in the soil profile. So basically what this tells us is, as the water is running off the parking lot and would contribute to flooding historically, by slowing that water down, allowing it to infiltrate into the rain garden, not only are we mitigating the impacts of the flood, but we're allowing that water to settle and percolate into the soil surface. There are a couple of lines up here which I think are important. This top line is what we refer to as field capacity, which is about 31%. And the bottom line is what we refer to as permanent wilting point at about 18%. Basically what this means is if you had a plant at your house in a potted soil, and you watered that pot to the point where water was draining out of the bottom of it, you would have reached what we call saturation. You've basically filled up all of the pore space in that soil with water, and so it's being forced to drain out. And that water is draining out under gravity. Once it's done draining, all of the water, the maximum amount of water that it's holding in the soil at that point is what we call field capacity. That is the maximum amount of water that's available for plants to grow. As the plant begins to use that water and deplete the water in the soil to the point where the plant can no longer extract it with the water in the soil with its roots, that's what we call permanent wilting point. That's the point at which that plant will begin to die. What this tells us is that at each of these depths, at 6 through 30 inches in the rain gardens, we were maximizing water almost at field capacity throughout the year, which means we had sufficient water in those basins to maintain plant life without any form of irrigation. Essentially, we were taking that flood water and using it as a resource as opposed to a pollutant. In the case of the rain garden, or the curb cuts without rain gardens, at some of the lower depths, we were depleting water almost to the point of permanent wilting point. And typically, if you were managing a landscape and you had to irrigate plants, you would have started irrigating before those soil moisture levels were depleted that far, meaning that you would have been using a water source to keep those plants alive. Whereas in the rain gardens, there was no need for that. If you want to actually quantify the amount of water that we were storing in those soils, basically where that flood water was going, not only did we have the capacity to hold over 1,000 gallons in each of those rain gardens by themselves, we were storing excess water in the soil profile throughout the year. So what you can see in the second column there is the number of gallons that you would expect in that 150 square feet at each of those 6-inch depths. So in the top 6 inches in the rain garden, we would be storing about 163 gallons of water. If you had a curb cut where you didn't pool or hold that water, essentially you only had about 148 gallons, which means we improved soil moisture at just that level by about 15 gallons for that 150 square feet. If you average those together, if you look at kind of what we did across the entire 30-inch profile, we stored about 120 extra gallons of water. To give you a sense of what this basin is, it's probably about the size of this platform where the other presenters are sitting. It's not exceptionally large. If you wanted to look at it in terms of an improvement on a cubic foot of soil basis, essentially we were improving water by about 0.3 of a gallon per cubic foot. And in terms of the amount that we were maintaining above permanent wilting point, we were almost improving it by a full gallon of extra water per cubic foot, which means that we had a tremendous reservoir of water at some of the lower depths in particular for plants as they became larger in those rain gardens to take advantage of as they matured and became more deeply rooted. If you wanted to look at soil moisture and how it changed through time, because essentially you would expect seasonal changes in soil moisture. You might have times when plants are dormant during the winter time, and essentially that moisture would be stored just in the soil, whereas in the summertime as the plants are transpiring water, you might expect or be worried that the water was being depleted from those basins. Essentially what we found is that we were again maximizing soil moisture across that 30-inch profile throughout each of the months. So the lowest time in terms of soil moisture within the rain gardens was in the month of January, but essentially we were storing water during the winter months when plants were dormant, making it available for when those plants were coming out of dormancy, and during months where we had average or above average rainfall during the monsoon season, we had plenty of water for those plants to take advantage of during particularly hot days. Essentially, we had no need for potable water inputs by taking advantage of the flood water that was coming off of the parking lot. This is essentially the final slide I'd like to share with you. This actually shows precipitation events for each day across the course of a year. The precipitation is shown on the green lines at the top, and you have a response in the soil moisture across the 30-inch profile, both in the rain garden and at curb cuts without a rain garden in the blue and red lines respectively. What's important to note here is that there were about 82 precipitation events across the course of a year, ranging anywhere from about 1/100th of an inch to about 0.67 inches. What we found is that on let's see, the spikes above the field capacity are an indication that we've completely saturated the soil and water is being allowed to infiltrate further down into the aquifer. So each time that there's a spike in soil moisture above that top field capacity, we can be assured that water is hopefully moving down through the soil profile and into our aquifer. We found that there were twice as many occurrences in the rain garden as opposed to areas without a rain garden. So essentially, again, the water is being pooled during heavy runoff, it's being captured, and it's being sent down into the soil profile. Not only is it recharging soil moisture for plants, but it's making it down further into the soil profile than if the water was allowed to run across the landscape. So if it wasn't captured in the rain garden, essentially you have flooding across the surface, and it's not being killed or captured by that soil. Interestingly, we had spikes above field capacity even during storms as small as 2/100ths of an inch in the rain gardens. So essentially a very small rainstorm could recharge that soil profile and hold that water in place, whereas in the locations without a rain garden, some precipitation events as much as a 1/4 inch were never actually showed up as a spike at all. Essentially, the water was moving across the soil surface and never being accumulated or held in the soil. So essentially, again, you would have had flood conditions during those times. Yeah, that's about what I had to share.